Dear listeners, welcome to the seventh story in the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Crooked Man. This is one of the most haunting, emotionally powerful, and tragic stories in the entire Sherlock Holmes canon. It is not merely a tale of murder, but a profound story of love, betrayal, revenge, guilt, and the long, cruel shadow cast by the Indian Mutiny of 1857. It features one of the most unforgettable and pitiable figures in all of Holmes's adventures, a man broken and deformed by cruelty, whose sudden appearance strikes terror into the hearts of those who see him. Narrated by Dr. John H. Watson, this adventure takes us from the peaceful sitting room at 221B, Baker Street to the disciplined military barracks of Aldershot, where a respected officer lies dead under mysterious circumstances. From the sudden cry of horror in the night to the shocking revelation behind the crooked man, every locked door, every desperate confession, every moment of guilt and remorse, and every brilliant deduction will be brought to life here in rich, vivid, and extended detail. So sit back, dim the lights if you can, and let us journey into a story where the sins of the past refuse to stay buried. The game is afoot. Opening scene, the late-night visitor at Baker Street. It was a warm summer evening in the year 1889. The gas lamps in Baker Street had been lit, casting a soft golden glow through the windows of 221B. I, Dr. John H. Watson, had spent a long day attending to my patients and was looking forward to a quiet evening with my friend Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was in one of his restless moods, pacing up and down the sitting room, his sharp mind clearly occupied with some problem. Suddenly, the front doorbell rang with unusual sharpness. A few moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a visitor, a tall, soldierly man of about 40 years, with a weather-beaten face, an upright military bearing, and an expression of deep distress. He introduced himself as Colonel James Barclay of the Royal Munsters. His face was pale, his hands trembled slightly, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had just witnessed something terrible. Colonel Barclay explained that a horrifying tragedy had occurred at his home in Aldershot the previous night. His wife, Nancy Barclay, had been found unconscious on the floor of a locked room. Her husband, Colonel Barclay himself, lay dead beside her with a terrible wound on his head. The door had been locked from the inside, and there was no sign of any weapon in the room. The only other person present was Nancy herself, who had screamed in horror before collapsing. The local police were treating it as a case of murder, and suspicion had already fallen heavily upon Mrs. Barclay. Colonel Barclay begged Holmes to come to Aldershot immediately, fearing that his wife would be wrongly accused of killing her husband. Holmes and Watson traveled to Aldershot. Holmes agreed without hesitation. We took the late evening train to Aldershot and arrived at the Barclay home late that night. The house was a fine villa in the military district, but an atmosphere of shock and grief hung heavily over it. Inside the locked room, we found a scene of violence and confusion. Colonel Barclay lay dead on the floor with a deep wound on the back of his head. His wife was still unconscious in another room, her face frozen in an expression of extreme terror and horror. The servants reported that they had heard a violent argument between husband and wife, followed by a terrible cry from Mrs. Barclay. "You coward! Give me back my life!" Then came the sound of a fall, and when they broke open the door, they found this dreadful scene. Holmes examined the room with his usual meticulous care. He noted that the door had indeed been locked from the inside. There were signs of a violent struggle. Most curiously, he found strange footprints on the floor, footprints that did not belong to either Colonel or Mrs. Barclay. He also discovered marks on the curtains and a small piece of wood on the floor that appeared to have been part of a wooden crate or box. Holmes's eyes gleamed with excitement. There was a third person in this room. "Watson," he said quietly. "Someone who entered through the window and left the same way. And that person was not an ordinary man." The investigation deepens. Strange clues and the crooked man. The next day, Holmes interviewed the servants and neighbors in detail. He learned that Mrs. Barclay had always been a kind and gentle woman, deeply loved by her husband. But on the night of the tragedy, she had returned from a meeting of the Guild of St. George in a state of great agitation. She had argued violently with her husband. The servants had heard her cry out those terrible words, "You coward! Give me back my life," before the door was locked. Holmes also discovered that a horribly deformed, crooked little man had been seen lurking near the house on several occasions. This man had spoken to Mrs. Barclay in the street, and she had seemed deeply disturbed, almost terrified, by the encounter. Holmes tracked down this mysterious figure. His name was Henry Wood. In a dramatic and deeply moving interview, Henry Wood revealed the full, tragic story that explained everything. The heartbreaking truth. The story of Henry Wood. Henry Wood had been a corporal in the same regiment as Colonel Barclay and Nancy, then Nancy Devoy, during the Indian Mutiny of 1857. He and Nancy had been deeply in love, but Barclay, jealous and ambitious, had betrayed Wood during the mutiny, deliberately sending him into a trap where he was captured by the rebels. For years, Wood was tortured and imprisoned under terrible conditions. He survived, but emerged horribly deformed and crippled, his body twisted, his face scarred, and his back bent. For 30 long years, he had lived in misery in India. When he finally returned to England, broken and penniless, he sought out Nancy. Seeing her again stirred all the old love and pain. On the night of the tragedy, he had entered the room through the window to speak with her. Colonel Barclay, suddenly confronted by the man he had betrayed so cruelly 30 years earlier, was overcome with guilt and terror. In the violent struggle that followed, Barclay fell and struck his head fatally on the corner of the fireplace fender. Nancy, horrified by the sudden appearance of her old lover and the death of her husband, had fainted. Henry Wood, terrified of being accused of murder, had fled through the window, leaving behind the scene that looked like a locked room murder. Holmes's compassionate resolution. Holmes revealed the full truth to the police. Since Colonel Barclay had died by accident and no murder had been committed, Mrs. Barclay was released from suspicion. Henry Wood was allowed to leave without charges. Holmes showed rare compassion, advising the broken man to leave the area and try to find some peace in his remaining years. Mrs. Barclay never fully recovered from the shock and grief. She lived quietly for the rest of her days, haunted by the past. Closing narration. And so, dear listeners, ended the tragic and deeply moving case of the adventure of the Crooked Man. It was not a story of cold-blooded murder, but of love, betrayal, revenge, and the long, cruel reach of the past. Sherlock Holmes once again proved that behind every locked door and every cry of horror, there is a deeply human story waiting to be understood. This adventure also showed Holmes's rare moments of compassion and his profound understanding of human nature. Thank you for listening to this detailed and extended audiobook narration of The Adventure of the Crooked Man, the 7th story from the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, share, and turn on notifications. The game is always afoot, and we shall return with more thrilling adventures of Sherlock Holmes very soon.